Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Circuit of the Americas post-sprint race reaction. Well, I thought that was a pretty wild and fantastic sprint race. What did you think? With that incident at the very beginning and then the incident at the end. Of course, that incident at the end kind of let off some of the go at the end, thinking that we might have some extra passes at near the end of it, and so we just kind of ended in that safety car. So that kind of dulled things down a little bit. But that first, stint where we had all the top four, part of the top four drivers, be an incident and get kind of knocked around was kind of really fantastic in that regard of just excitement and turnaround. It was a very disappointment for your McLaren drivers. And if you're a Red Bull driver, then you're all thinking all of a sudden, can Max actually take it to the Drivers' Championship now that he has an extra 8 points on the board, from those McLaren drivers? So what will happen in the main event on Sunday? You will have to wait and see if he gains a lot more ground or if it's just a little bit. But after knocking the McLarens out, they didn't get the test and have that feel for this track as well as they would like for the qualifying or the race itself on Sunday. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But what did you think? Whose fault was it? If you were going to give some kind of fault to some driver in that first lap incident, who would you blame? Now for me, that was of course it's all pretty much a lap one incident, so no one's to blame directly and no one got any penalties for that. But if I was going to have to blame someone, I would have to blame probably Oscar. I know a lot of people were thinking that it was Hulkenberg's fault for being up there and where he wasn't directly supposed to be, but I think he was really defending himself against Alonso in that position, trying to judge out that space. And I think it was really Oscar who just kind of cut in, not really understanding where everybody was in that positioning, and just ended up having to hit and collide with Hulkenberg, which collided with Alonso. That's actually then pushed Oscar into Lando and knocked in three of those drivers out of this sprint race. But what was your thoughts, and who would you blame if you had to blame someone? Was it going to be Oscar? Was it going to be Hulkenberg? Or was it going to be somebody else? I was just kind of interested in hearing your thoughts and opinions on that. And just like normal, I go through the back of the pack and work my way up to the front. And so we'll start off with Fernando Alonso, who started off in 6th place and ended up in that 20th place with a DNF after getting hit by, Hulkenberg, who was actually really pushed into Alonso by Oscar Piastri. So that kind of knocked Alonso out on that turn one, lap one incident. So he really didn't get to see a whole lot of Alonso, but he did make it up to 6th place for that sprint qualifying, so that was a really good start. So I think he was doing pretty well. Unfortunately, he got knocked out, and so we really didn't get to see exactly what I would have done in this sprint race. But I would have given him a pretty good props for getting up there into that sprint running, even to start off with. This gets us to Oscar Piastri, who started off in 3rd and ended up in 19th with a DNF. Of course, he ended up going wide because Lando was a little bit sluggish on the start, and then decided to cut back in and try to take the inside, for that next turn. And then unfortunately, Hulkenberg was kind of there, and so he kind of ran into Hulkenberg, who pushed Hulkenberg into Alonso. But he also, when he hit Hulkenberg, it kind of pushed him into, his own teammate Lando and knocking those people out. So unfortunately, that didn't quite work out for them. I think in general, he had a pretty good start. It just turned out kind of a wrong place, wrong timing in that first corner. I think if he would have taken it a little bit more cautious, of course, whose driver is going to take it cautious? It would be around that, to get around that corner safely and then put some pressure on his teammate, a little bit later in that lap. This gets us to Lando Norris, who started off in 2nd and ended up in 18th with a DNF. He had a sluggish start, which kind of caused a little bit of this issues because he kind of got off a little bit slow, let his teammate kind of cup and almost pass him at the very beginning. And then going into the corner, his teammate decided to, instead of going around the outside, try to cut back and go into the inside. And that kind of made Oscar hit again, Hulkenberg, who then got pushed into Lando Norris that knocked him out of this race at the very beginning. So Lando was doing really good to get up there in second. Of course, it's not quite where they needed to be to really put pressure on the drivers' championship. I mean, he was ahead of his teammate, which was good, but we had of course Max Verstappen, who was ahead of them both, which was going to put a little bit more damper on the things because the point gap would have been that much less to deal with. Unfortunately, because those two McLaren drivers got knocked out, and that gave Max a nice 8-point gain on those two McLaren drivers. So we'll have to see if that actually puts him really in the hunt for the drivers' championship or not. And of course, with those McLaren drivers getting knocked out of the sprint race, they have less data to fill in for the qualifying for the GP race and for the GP race itself to try to take advantage of that, where that Red Bull has all of that data. So he's probably going to have a better advantage going into that full GP race than the McLaren drivers anyway. So that may put a little bit more extra pressure on the McLarens as well. Then we come to Lance Stroll, who started off in 14th and ended up in 17th with a DNF. He had to box on the very first lap to change tires after all that lap 1 incidents issues. He did hit Franco on turn 1, lap 1, kind of getting squeezed in there, didn't have a lot of place to go. I think that was part of it. He did pass Borletto on lap 12 for 13th. And then he went deep at the end, locking up his tires in turn 1 on lap 16, and then hit Oscar, knocking both him and Ocon out. So he went really deep into that turn 1 on lap 16 to knock Ocon and himself out. Came in from too far away, locked up. He just realized he couldn't do it, but locked up the tires, and unfortunately just kind of collided with Ocon in that. So it's totally, Lance Stroll's fault in that regard. I'm not even sure why he was really pushing that hard, as they weren't into the points to begin with. So that was some question marks there for Lance Stroll's, why he was doing that for a sprint race. Now, if it was a total GP race, be one thing, but of course the sprint race, then they have to fix that car before the qualifying session. So that kind of puts some damper on the mechanics and having to jump into that and try to fix things on a quick manner. So a really bad one for Lance Stroll, in my opinion. Esteban Ocon started off in 19th and ended up in 16th, gaining some positions, but was a DNF as well because of that contact with Lance Stroll. He did gain 7 spots at the very first lap, so he did a really good start there. And of course, 3 of those were because of the 2 McLaren drivers and Alonso dropping out. But that's still a pretty good start, gaining positions on that first lap. And then he got hit by Stroll on lap 16 on turn 1 that knocked him out of this race. So I think he had a poor start, poor qualifying session, but started making it up in that sprint race, gaining some ground, and doing some decent work, even though he wasn't quite in the points at that time. So I think it was a decent run for Ocon. It just didn't turn out that well overall. This gets us to Oliver Behrman, who started off in 16th and ended up in 15th. So again, he gained a position, even though it really wasn't that good of a spot for him. In that running, I think he would have gained a lot more ground. Unfortunately, he was a little too aggressive on his defensive positions. That cost him some time penalty, but he did gain 8 spots the very first lap, so he did a good run at the very start. And as I said, he was defending against Kimi and kind of left the track on that, kept that position, and so he's gained to have an advantage after leaving the track, which would cost him a 10-second penalty, which dropped him quite a bit. But he was that last position for the points, so it's kind of interesting. I know the announcers were saying that it was probably worthwhile to keep on the gas and see if he would have gotten that penalty or not. But from that review, I would have thought that they probably should have given that position up and see if he could make it back up in that time limit, even though it kind of got ended early because of that safety car between Stroll and Ocon. So it would have turned out probably still out of the points, but I think it would have looked better in that regard for Oliver Behrman. But I think he was doing a really good job up to that point and was giving his all to try to keep that last point position So I can't blame him really totally for that. They just dropped him way out and make him look not quite as good for the sprint race that where he really was in the sprint race. So that all to say, decent job for Oliver. Just got caught in that penalty that dropped him, basically the last person in the field, that didn't DNF. This gets into Franco Colapinto, who started off in 17th and ended up in 14th. I really don't have any other information for him on that regard to figuring out what was happening to him or why he was in that back of the field so much. I think he actually did have to pit on the first lap as well, so that probably put him in that offset a little bit, but he should have been able to gain a little bit more ground, I think, in all regards to that. Then we come to Nico Hülkenberg, who started off in 4th and ended up in 13th. He did lose 11 spots in the very first lap because of that incident in the very beginning where he got spun around. Then he had the front wing totally taken off, where he had to come into the pits to replace that front wing and maybe some tires due to that debris. He also hit Alonso due to that Oscar hitting him, pushing him in that turn 1, lap 1 incident. But later on, he was able to make up a little bit of ground, passing Isaac Hajjar for 15th on lap 12. But of course, I think he got repassed a little bit later. Then we come to Isaac Hajjar, who started off in 12th and ended up in 12th. He did lose 4 spots at the very first lap. And of course, you tie that with the other 3 spots. And so that was a pretty bad run for him to start off. So a pretty bad start. But he was able to pass Hülkenberg again on that back and forth a little bit on lap 12 for that 15th spot, where he ended up, where he started off with. So not a good run for Isaac Hajjar. Hopefully he'll be able to bounce back a little bit from that in the race, on Sunday. Gabriel Borletto started off in 20th and ended up in 11th. He gained 7 spots on the very first lap and basically stayed there for the rest of this session. So a decent start for him, gaining some ground, getting back up there. Of course, not quite where his teammate was, up in that 4th position, so he has a little bit of work to do there. But he did, keep it out of trouble, so he ended up finishing just unfortunately just outside of the points in that 11th position instead of that 8th that we needed to be in for the sprint race. So he still has a little bit of work to do there, but it's a little bit better start for him. So hopefully that'll give him some confidence going in. And I think that those are some of those issues with, going into the qualifying session, getting caught out because everybody's going really, really slow in that regard. Same thing with Isaac Hajjar. Going out slow on that slow out lap, slow push, so they didn't really make that qualifying session for the sprint, which kept him in the back, and then trying to gain ground from there. This gets us to Pierre Gasly in that top 10, where he started off in 13th and ended in that 10th position. He did gain 4 spots at the very first lap, so 3 of those were DNF issues, so he gained really 1 spot on that very first lap. It was just still a decent run, gaining around and just kind of staying out of most of the trouble. Not quite getting into the points, but in that Alpine, which they still have quite a bit of work to do apparently, but still getting a little bit of form in that Alpine around this track. And I know he pretty much likes, so hopefully that'll pay off in the race on Sunday, and so they can get that data from the sprint race. Liam Lawson started off in 15th and ended up in 9th, gained 4 spots in the very first lap, and then he passed Gasly for 10th on lap 9. So a decent run, of course, again, not where he wants to be, and of course, ahead of his teammate, which is always a good thing in that Racing Bulls for Liam Lawson. But I think they was trying to get up there and get that Kimi last point position, which he was not quite able to do in that regard as well. And then, of course, we had Oliver Bearman technically in that position, then got that 10-second penalty that pushed him back. So there's that aspect as well in that. So not the greatest run for Liam Lawson, but getting up there, hopefully they get some more data for the race on Sunday. Kimi Antonelli started off in 11th and ended up in 8th. Not a great start, only gaining 1 spot on the very first lap. Of course, that's not including the 3 that he would have directly gotten. So he really only had that little bit of aspect there, and only losing 1 spot due to all of that. But still a decent run. He had a good fight with Oliver Bearman. going back and forth, eventually not really gaining the position, but of course, after looking at it, Oliveira went outside of the track limits, which cost him that 10-second penalty, which pushed him up into that final point position. So a decent run, just not where he needs to be with his teammate up there in the front, really pushing pressure on George Russell. But he's still learning and gaining some ground, so that's good to see. And again, having two cars make it to the end, hopefully gaining some data for the Mercedes on how they should play out things in the race on Sunday. Yuki Tsunoda started off in 18th and ended up in 7th, gaining a whopping 11 spots in the very first lap. So he had a really good start, even if you count those 3 spots off that run. That's a really good start for him, getting up and getting that ground. I know he was frustrated with that last qualifying issues there in that spot, but ended up catching Hulkenberg's front wing on that very first lap as well, carrying it around the track and still somehow making it around and not having any issues because of that. So that was really good to see. Hopefully he can, carry that forward in the race on Sunday. But a really good run, I think, for Yuki, gaining some spots at the very beginning, even though his qualifying session was kind of off in that regard. This gets us to Alexander Albon, who started off in 9th and ended up in 6th, gaining 3 spots the very first lap, so just the default 3, and then basically maintaining that position. So he was kind of hurting a little bit, I think, compared to his teammate, getting up there, but not quite where he needed to be, not really gaining the positions that he wanted to be in the qualifying session, so he didn't quite get them in the race either. So that kind of hurt him there, but I think they're on the right track for that Williams. They seem to be moving forward in that Williams, so hopefully they can piece things together again for the race tomorrow and see where they end up and get some decent points for that Williams. This gets us to our top 5, where we find Charles Leclerc, who started off in 10th and ended up in 5th, gaining 6 positions on the very first lap. And he was doing really well for most of this race, but on lap 9, he went a little bit wide, and the S's kind of lost track of issues, kind of went wide, which opened the door for his teammate Lewis Hamilton to pass him on that lap. So unfortunately for him, it was his teammate, which is always hurts to have your teammate pass you, especially when you're the one making the mistake in that regard. But it's still a good run for Charles Leclerc and that Ferrari. Hopefully they can get back up there in the race and give him some more points to put a little bit more pressure on the Mercedes and potentially the Red Bulls for that second position on that constructor's standing. This gets us to Lewis Hamilton, who started off in 8th and ended up in 4th. He gained 3 spots at the very first lap, and then he passed Leclerc for 4th on lap 9. So a really good run for him. He didn't quite get the start he wanted, only gaining the default number of spots because of those DNFs, but was able to maintain it and then take advantage of his teammate when he went wide and kind of took over that and made him all the way up into that 4th position. So really good run for Lewis Hamilton in the end of that sprint. And then, of course, we come to, a lot of the crowd's favorite, apparently, it was Carlos Sainz, who started off in 7th and ended up in 3rd, gaining 4 spots at the very first lap and kind of maintaining that 3rd position pretty handily throughout this sprint race, not really being put pressure on by either the Ferraris, but not really being able to keep up with George Russell in that Mercedes or Max Verstappen in that Red Bull. So he kind of handed it to him in that 3rd position, but it's still a good run for him, getting some really decent points for Williams and himself in that run. So I think a really good job for Carlos Sainz. George Russell started off in 5th and ended up in 2nd. He gained 3 spots at the first lap. And then, of course, he was going back and forth a little bit, gaining some ground on Max through that very first couple of laps when they actually went for the green flags, and was gaining some ground. Of course, he was on a little bit more used tires and was really pushing it, and so I think he decided he had to really go for it. And so on lap 8, turn 12, he went and sent it from pretty far away and ended up pushing Max out of the bounds of the track. And of course, he went out of bounds of the track, so he had to give the position back up, and then was never able to really put any more pressure on Max Verstappen in that run. So, but still kind of an interesting, jump in that, really push for that, first position, and still a good position for, ended up in 2nd for, George Russell in that Mercedes after signing that contract with the Mercedes too. So that's always a good plus on his side of things. This gets us to our, sprint race winner, who's Max Verstappen, who started off in first and ended up in first. He had a really good start, keeping the lead, and he had a good, restart for that first safety car. And of course, the second safety car went through the end of the race, and so he didn't have to worry about that. But a really good run for him, defending from George, making that gap, maintainable, and then kind of into the end of the race where he needed to be in that first position, gaining 8 points on the McLaren drivers. So that was all great to see. So to give you a rundown of how the sprint race went, of course, we had a safety car that came out on lap 1 and went through lap 5. So that kind of shut everything down in the timing for that little bit of a period. But on that very, green flag lap 5, we have Max with a 0.703 second lead over Russell. By lap 10, it was a 1.65 second lead for Max over Russell. And lap 15, it was a 2.82 second lead for Max over Russell. And then, of course, we had lap 19, where at the end of the race, which is only a 0.395 second lead for Max over Russell because of that safety car that came out on lap 16 that went through the rest of the race. And so I had to group the field back together, hoping that they were going to be able to restart that race, but never were able to. So that kind of ended under safety car conditions. So we had a fantastic start of the race where we had lots of action, lots of chaos, lots of collisions in that running, and then we had a little bit of slower start because of that. After that, because of the safety car, a decent run, and then of course you had to end it up under a safety car, so that kind of killed the momentum of that sprint race. So what did you think of the sprint race overall? So what did this do to our driver standings? Of course, we have Oscar Piastri still in the lead with his still 336 points. But of course, we see Max Verstappen gaining ground on the McLaren drivers now with 281. Russell now with 244 and Charles Leclerc with 177. What the big changes here we really see are Carlos Sainz jumping up to that 10th position now at 38 points, jumping over Nico Hülkenberg and Fernando Alonso. And then, of course, we have Yuki jumping up to 16th place over Pierre Gasly, now with 22 points. And for the constructor standing, of course, we have McLaren that won it in Singapore. And so we basically have them still with 650 points after gaining no points. But we have Mercedes gaining some ground with 333 points. Ferrari with 307 points. Red Bull now with 300 points, so they're gaining ground on Ferrari there. And then we have Williams with 111 points. So that kind of lays this land. We didn't get any changes in the constructors for the second position or beyond or below. So we'll have to see if the full race on Sunday will change that. And of course, what we have coming up next is the World GP race on Sunday, October 19th, with a length of 3.426 miles, with 56 laps being run for a total race distance of 191.835 miles. It was first introduced in 2012, and the lap record holder is Charles Leclerc in 2019 with 1 minute 36.169 seconds. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.